I am seeing this question so much, is that moms are saying, look, I really, really want to have a home birth. I want to have a natural birth without intervention. I want to avoid all the cascade of interventions. I've seen the business of being born, but other people are telling me it's safer to give birth in the hospital. And I don't feel like I have a lot of options. Maybe it's their first baby and they're saying, well, maybe for my first baby, I should have my baby in the hospital. And I mean, I got this a lot with my own birth because I had said, I'm having a home birth with my first. I don't want to have a hospital birth. And everybody around me was like, I don't know, because you don't know how labor is going to go for you. And what if something goes wrong? And, you know, the hospital is around for a reason. Like, babies used to die, moms used to die. And that's why we have hospitals. Like, thank God we have them, because it's so dangerous to have a baby at home. Like, that's a trend. Well, first of all, we have been birthing at home for far longer than we've been birthing in the hospitals. The hospitals didn't really get popular until closer to the 1960s. Up until that point, if you watch Call the Midwife, they still had a lot of home births. It might have been a little bit earlier inside of the American system in the North America, but the fact remains is that a lot of babies were still born at home, and then we had more of a surge of hospital births happening after World War II. And there's a reason for that too, and I'd love to get into that detail, but I did get into it with my students inside the Take Charge of Birth program. We are currently going through Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage. So you can go and pick up that book by Rachel Reed, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, and it actually explains more about this. But what I want to talk to you about is that the idea of the hospital and all of the interventions is really considered a right of protection. Rachel Reed again talks about this, the rights of protection, which is basically the idea of childbirth is inherently needing to have the mother protected. But we've skewed the way that it was originally intended. Because when you're having a physiological birth, you are not in your head. Not in your thinking part of your brain anyway. You're in your mammal part of your brain. Ina May Gaskin talks about this in Ina May's Guide to Childbirth as let your monkey do it. And it's really true, because I see this even with my clients, is that when they are in actual active labor, they're not thinking anymore. And the same thing for myself, when I'm in active labor, I'm no longer in my thinking cerebral part of my brain going, okay, how many centimeters dilated am I and how far apart are my contractions? No, I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm not even thinking about what I need in terms of preparation for leaving my space, because as I said, I plan home birth. But even with my first baby, when I was talked into having a hospital birth, I noticed that once I went back into my thinking part of my brain, labor was a lot more intense. And I also noticed that it wasn't progressing as quickly as I thought. And there's all, again, a reason for this, is that mammals, we are designed to give birth in our mammalian part of our brain. And the rights of protection, which is our family and our protectors, our care providers, and our people that we have in our environment that are supporting us and facilitating the physiological process, they are there to make sure that we are safe. I talked about this a little bit last week when I talked about the idea of the tiger chasing you, or maybe that might have been a few weeks ago, but it's true, is that originally our rights of protection were the other members of our community, our family, our friends, our partner, would gather space around us, hold space while we were laboring, and make sure that the outside environment was safe. But then the patriarchy came in and decided that women's bodies are defective and that we need to save our babies from ourselves. So then the rights of protection that they have often in the hospital, additional monitoring, vaginal exams, IV in labor instead of allowing you to eat and drink as you need to, putting you on your back, just figuring out where you are in the timeline for birth, all of this is a rite of protection that's seeing you as the defective birthing body and the baby needing to be the end product. It's a very industrialist way of looking at it, and it makes sense because obstetrics was invented during the Industrial Revolution when we understood things as machines. So the body has even been explained as a machine. And we now know that your emotional state also can affect your physical and physiological processes. That's why a lot of times when you have certain symptoms that can't be explained, it's explained away by stress, because in a way it's true. Now, not everything is explained away by stress. Sometimes we have real things that are a problem. And as women, especially, the medical system just like writes us off, and we have to complain at a much greater scale than if a man came in with the same symptoms. And again, this is because not only was our medical system based on the idea of the Industrial Revolution and our bodies as machines, but oftentimes women's bodies were not even studied outside of reproduction. So again, they are looking at only the male symptoms when it comes to certain diseases or anything that comes up. And I would love to again get into this, but I only have so much time. And right now our focus is on hospital birth versus home birth. So I hear this a lot, even with medical professionals, and they say, oh, you can have a home birth in the hospital. Well, no, I'm sorry, you can't have a home birth in the hospital. You can have a physiological birth in the hospital. You can get some protection from the medical model of birth and have an unmedicated physiological birth in the hospital, but it is not the same. And I can tell you this from experience because I've had 2 physiological births, one in the hospital and one at home. And the difference is that at home, I was not disturbed at all. Nobody tried to check me. Nobody was assessing me. Nobody was telling me how long I was supposed to be in labor for. Nobody was telling me to be quiet. Nobody was pestering me and asking me, am I sure I don't need medication? Nobody was coming in and interrupting my process and saying, how are you doing? Nobody was expecting me to get on a fetal monitor. Like all of these things that happen as a routine in a hospital, none of that happens in a home birth. You are in control of your own environment. You decide who you let into that environment. You decide what you're wearing in that environment. You're not feeling self-conscious because you could whip off your entire outfit and be like, I'm just going to walk around naked and nobody's going to say anything about it. If you're hungry at any point, you can go and get yourself a snack. In the hospital, you're basically stuck with whatever food that you brought with you, or you're begging your partner to go and get you a damn sandwich. And then you have to deal with the nurse saying, oh, well, we don't really want you to eat and drink. We would prefer you to just have clear liquids or ice chips, or here's the IV because you need fluids, but we're not going to give you anything by mouth. Like all these stupid things that happen. And it varies from hospital to hospital. So that's how you know that it's not evidence-based because it varies. Some hospitals require the IV on admittance, and by required, it means that it's in their policy. They're going to be the ones to say that, well, you know, we really prefer you to have this. However, you as the patient, as the client, can still say no, okay? However, if you're going into the hospital and they have these policies, now you're also fighting in labor, which means you have to stay in your thinking brain. And if you're in your thinking brain, you're not able to get into your labor trance and you're constantly taken out of this. So I was in my labor trance and I was doing my own thing and I was swaying and I was in triage, and all of a sudden I hear in the background a nurse saying, if she goes fast, she's going in triage. So that suddenly made me panic because I did not want to be birthing inside this teeny tiny little curtained off area. I wanted to be in the tub. And so that put stress on me because now I'm hearing outside noises. They bring another mom into the same area in the triage, and I can hear her in the curtain next to me, and she's making noises as we do in labor, but it's interfering with my process and my concentration of me making my noises. So again, and at home, the only laboring person that you've got is you. So you're the one who's in complete control of your environment, and you're the only one allowed to make sounds. You're the only one allowed to be talking. Like, you can tell everybody around you to shut up, and it's okay. In the hospital, there's going to be background conversations. So you're going to have to find a way to block those out, which can be very difficult, especially if you're a very sensory person. See, I myself am very sensitive to like sensory things. If I go into a grocery store, I have to be like in a meditative state. I have to meditate before I go into a grocery store. This is why I prefer to have all my groceries delivered, because the bright lights and the people and the noise, the background music and the noise from the people, and like it's too much. After I go to the grocery store, I usually have to have some rest time. Same thing for like just going out anywhere where there's lots of people and lots of noise. And the hospital is a very busy place, and there's people in the next room, and there's people in the hall, and there's people coming in. Whereas at home, you can again control that environment. So if you're very sensory, then again, you're going to want to know, how do I protect this space? So the next thing, of course, is that hospitals have certain policies and certain things that they need to check off their list. And one of them for my particular hospital was having my blood drawn. They wanted me to have my blood drawn while I was in the middle of labor. Now, if you haven't been following me for very long, I'm just going to tell you right now, I hate needles. I cannot stand them. I don't like them. They're just, I freak out, and I have this reaction to them where I then throw up. Like, it's not good. It's more than just a phobia. It's actually like a physical reaction that I have. I have to take Ativan before I have a needle. I have to make sure that I'm using the numbing cream. I have to use my breathing techniques to get through it. Even if it's a teeny tiny little pinprick that I barely feel, my body does not like it and reacts. So I know this about me. And this is part of the reason why I was planning a natural birth, even in the hospital, was because I knew that I don't do well with needles and I don't do well with drugs. So this nurse is like, I'm here to take your blood. And I'm like, I don't want that. I said on my birth plan that I don't want that. Here's the thing. Your hospital is not going to pay as much attention to your birth plan, which is why you need to hire your care provider ahead of time. And you need to know what your birth environment is going to be like so that you're protected and you know ahead of time that they're going to push this on you. I had a discussion with my care provider, and my midwife had said, this is one of the things that they have on routine admission. And I said, put it in my birth records and everything that I don't want that. And I thought that that would have been enough. I didn't understand that within the medical system, all of the departments don't really talk to each other, and that the day I went into labor, they still were going by that checklist. They were not going by what was written inside of the notes for my health plan or anything that my midwife had written down. My midwife had even said, she says she doesn't want this, and they still could not go by her. They had to get my refusal. So they still pestered me while I was in labor. Had I known that that was coming, I might have been more prepared for it. But at that moment, I was freaking out because I'm like, how am I going to get them to go away and leave me alone? Because now I'm feeling like they are basically going to assert their authority on me. I didn't do very well with authority figures back then. So for me, it was just that stress. And as you may know from what I've talked about with physiological birth before, is that stress is the enemy of oxytocin. So naturally, my cervix probably closed up a little bit more. And naturally, my labor probably slowed down a little bit more because now I'm not feeling safe. And if I had been going into labor and moving into transition. Well, things were already reversed by that point because I'm like, I don't feel safe. So again, you need to know that if you're having a home birth, nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to come in and suddenly say, okay, we're going to draw your blood. Or nobody's going to come in and say, okay, we need to have you on the monitor for 20 minutes. Or nobody's going to come in and say, we need to run this IV. Nobody's going to come in and say, we need to assess your progress, so we're going to do a vaginal exam. Nobody's going to say that to you at home. Whereas in the hospital, even though you can say no to these things, you're still having to get out of your mammalian brain in order to say no. And I mean, I hate saying this but it's something that I really need to warn you about, is that some hospitals and some medical staff, they don't like to hear no. And there is a lot of abuse that happens within the system. And this is why it's imperative that you have somebody in your corner who knows exactly what you want, who can support you. And I talk to all of my clients about this. I'm like, look, like if you have your partner, then you need to have them 100% on board. Not just a little bit. They can't just watch 1 or 2 little videos. They need to be on board. They need to be as informed as you are when it comes to your birth. Because if they're not, then something that you may not have discussed with them, they're now going by what the care providers are telling you to do, or they'll say something and they'll say, can you hold her down so we can do this? We have to do this. It's for the safety of the baby. And your partner's now freaking out because they're like, well, they want your child to be safe, and they also want you to be safe, and you're being unreasonable in the eyes of the healthcare system. And your partner has basically been trained, just as you may have been trained within our culture, to just do what the doctor says. And then you have a whole big mess where you're now complying with something that you didn't really want, that isn't really medically necessary, and then can lead to you not having a physiological birth because now they're trying to introduce interventions. So for me, I had said I'm only going to have one vaginal exam upon admission and another one for suspected transition, and that's it. Now, if I had known ahead of time that I could have said no to all vaginal exams and understood that there's other ways to assess progress, and that vaginal exams are completely pointless when you're having a physiological birth. They can be helpful if you're having like a medicated birth where you have now introduced intervention that is now basically hijacking the physiological process. That makes sense. But as a matter of routine for a physiological birth, it is like not necessary, and actually your cervix hates being checked. So if I had known that ahead of time, I would have said no vaginal exams. But the hospital I was also in is very much, they like to assess progress and they feel that it's necessary. And I had noticed this even after I'd had my 2 vaginal exams and I was just in my zone again, and I'm like, I don't have to have any more. And the nurse kept pestering me while the midwife was away with another client. And she's like, I think we should get the midwife back to check you. And I shake my head no. And she's like, well, Carly, like, I think that it would be a good time to be checked. Like, you haven't had a check in a while. And I'm shaking my head no. And then suddenly, like, this is with me having the gas and trying to stay in my labor trance. And everything's fuzzy, but she's taking me out of my labor trance, and I'm hearing her voice, and she's interrupting my thoughts. And I'm getting really annoyed at this point. And then I can hear the midwife suddenly say, no, she said she doesn't want any more checks, so she's not going to get any more checks. And I'm thinking, thank God, like somebody listened to me. But what if you get a midwife who is not 2 years away from retirement, and then she's like, she might be only a few years into her certification. Now we also have the problem of they're being watched inside the hospital. Inside a home birth setting, your midwife has more leeway because they can fudge the details on a report for whatever reason. They can say, oh yeah, they were this many centimeters at this time, if they're told to that they have to do vaginal exams, and then like they could do none. But in the hospital, there's usually a nurse in the room too, who's kind of spying on the midwife. And same thing is I've read this inside Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, that there are midwives, it's like the client didn't want her waters broken. I didn't want to break her waters. There was no need to break her waters. But then the OB came into the room and said, why are the membranes still intact? Break her waters. And at that point, that's where the hierarchy comes in of power that again tells them we have to break your water. So can you have the physiological birth? Yes, you can have a physiological birth in the hospital if you have a very strong advocate next to you. If you happen to know the system and know the loopholes and know exactly what to say in order to assert your rights and make sure that they don't touch you. If your care provider is 100% on board and isn't afraid to go up against their colleagues. Because again, as I said, the hospital environment, it's a culture within itself. And the colleagues can be a real problem for your care provider, even if they themselves are supportive of physiological birth. So if the environment is not right, if the care provider is not right, if the support's not right, then unfortunately, a physiological birth is really hard to have, especially if you go into the hospital too early. Like this was another problem, that's that I'd gone into the hospital a little too early. I wish that I hadn't done it at all, to be honest. But then I wouldn't be here talking to you because I would have been like, la la la, I had my awesome birth and that's my end of my story. And I wouldn't have known about what was going on in the system. So I understand why it happened the way it did, because I mean, I do believe that some things happen for a reason. And I have this message that I want to make sure that you have this information, because I sure didn't have it. I didn't know anything about what I was walking into when I agreed to have a hospital birth just to be safer. And let me just say one thing about safety is that it's relative. Okay? It's really relative. What feels safe for one person is another person's nightmare. So some people feel really safe when they have the monitor. They feel safe knowing their progress. They feel safe with the epidural. They feel safer having a C-section than attempting a vaginal birth. That's their choice. But if that's your worst nightmare, then you don't want to be thinking in the terms of, well, that's safer, so I have to do it. You want to be thinking in the terms of what feels safest to me. And honestly, continuous electronic monitoring has been shown to increase the chances of having a C-section, and induction has increased the chances of having a C-section. Pitocin, you know how I feel about Pitocin, breaking your waters, keeping you inside the bed, having an IV, all of these routine interventions are hijacking the physiological birth process. The safest kind of birth that you can have when you have no complications, and notice how I said with no complications, is to make sure that it's a physiological birth and that it will unfold as it will. And your instincts are very powerful. And if at any point you feel that something isn't right and that you need the medical help, then that's the time to go and get it. But doing it just because it's expected of you, because everybody else around you thinks that it's safer, is not going to serve you, especially if your goal is to have a physiological birth and avoid those interventions. So that's what I have to say about that, about safety. And of course, there are so many studies that have been done on home birth. And a lot of times, the ones that say that home birth is less safe than a hospital, they usually lump in unplanned home births into that same thing. And those mothers may not have been planning to have a home birth. They might have panicked, or they might have had certain complications and they weren't able to get to a hospital. I mean, when you lump all these different categories into something that shouldn't be lumped together, then you get all sorts of skewed data. So the next thing, of course, is that if you're going to be safer at home, especially if you're planning a vaginal birth after cesarean VBAC, more likely you're going to be able to have a successful VBAC if you're planning a physiological birth. if you're inducing, if you're on the monitor, if you're having multiple vaginal exams, if you're having all this fear injected into you by people around you in that unsupportive environment, it's not going to be as good for you to be able to have a VBAC. I mean, you may still be able to do it, but it's not going to be as likely as if you were at home. So a lot of moms who have had more than one cesarean end up realizing that they are not going back to the hospital no matter what. And then there's a whole other issue of, can you get a midwife to support you? Well, for this, I'm going to tell you another little secret, okay? A hospital birth is just a home birth transfer, okay? Because often what is said is, if you want to have a natural birth, labor at home as long as possible and then go in when you feel safe. And your care provider, who is not supportive of a physiological birth, will say, as soon as your contractions are 4 minutes apart, or as soon as your water breaks, come in. Well, there's a reason for that, because now they're going to put you on the monitor. They're going to assess your progress. If you're not progressing by a certain point, they're going to run Pitocin. If your waters have released before you've gone into full-blown labor, they're going to try to kickstart that. Like all of these things, now they've put you on a clock. If, however, your waters release, everything seems fine, you don't feel any need to go in, you can continue as you are as long as you feel safe at home, and then make the decision later if you want to transfer and get your labor started, or if labor is already started, if you feel like things are not moving quickly enough and you want to get them moving, then yeah, absolutely, you can go and get some medical help. But if you're feeling, no, I'm good, I'm just going to do my thing, I'm just going to do my process, and you get to the point of transition and suddenly your waters break if they hadn't already broken, and baby's coming now. Well, this happened to a friend of mine. She wanted to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean, and the midwives in our area are not really allowed to do that. Like they are discouraged from attending a home birth after cesarean. There's a real big uphill battle. You can still do it, but the health authority, of course, really frowns on it. And there's just a lot of stigma attached to it. And that's one of the problems with licensure of midwives, is that then they're under all these restrictions that may not be evidence-based, but it's keeping the medical model going. So she knew, because she'd been working with me in improving birth, just what we were up against. And she's like, you know what, it's just not worth the fight. So I'm just going to labor at home as long as humanly possible. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell them, no, I'm not going on the monitor and I'm not going to have vaginal exams. I'm just going to birth on the bed, and they can watch me birth my baby on the bed in the hospital. And that was her plan. Only she'd been induced the first time. So she didn't know that those more intense surges that were happening, that she was like, oh, I can breathe through these no problem and I still get to rest every 2 minutes. Like, she was not aware that she was at the end. So when she's like, okay, things are getting really intense now, I think I'm in active labor, I think we're going to go to the hospital, poof, water's released. And she just suddenly realized, we're not going anywhere. So because she had a midwife, she just had the midwife come to the house. So she's like, look, like, I am like at the point where like baby's coming, you need to come here instead of try and get to the hospital, because I don't think I can get in the car. So then they of course called the ambulance too, because that's part of the protocol. And then the midwife came and assessed things and said, well, you know, we have enough time to move you. And she's like, do I have to get on that stupid bed? And then the EMT is like, yeah, like that's the protocol. You have to get on the bed for transport. And she's like, then there's no way. I'm birthing this baby right here. You can go. I'm not doing anything else. So by that point, she birthed her baby at home, even though it was technically unplanned. That was one of her backup plans. So the thing is that if you're called to have a home birth, if you really feel like home is the safest place for you and you choose to labor at home as long as possible, have it in the back of your mind that if you feel like you don't really want to move anywhere, that they can come to you. Because right now our system is really messed up, and they say you're not allowed to have a home birth for X next such and such reason. But the reality is that unplanned home births happen all the time, and moms still get help. Or you could have your baby on the side of the road and moms still get help. So would it be the worst thing in the world if you just stayed home, even though you're told you're not allowed to? And if at any point you decide to transfer, that's still an option. You can always change your mind. But it's easier to change your mind and have a home birth than it is to be in the hospital early in labor and be like, you know what, I really, really hate this. And there's actually a meme where they have this pregnant woman in labor, and the doctor's like, what are you doing? And she's like, oh, I changed my mind, and she's walking out the door. I mean, the joke is, oh, she changed her mind about going into labor. But for me, when I see that, it's, I changed my mind. I don't really want to be in this hospital, and I'm a going home. That's how I personally take that meme. But I know what the original intention of it was. But the idea is that it's easier to just stay home and not be on that clock for as long as possible. So the next thing I wanted to mention is that what I tell my clients, because this is something that I tell them quite often, is that they'll come to me and they'll say, you know, like, I can't see myself giving birth in the hospital again. I just can't do it. Like, I've had 2 C-sections. I've had 3 C-sections. I just can't. Like, it's just freaking me out here. But my partner is not on board. Well, first of all, you want your partner to watch The Business of Being Born and maybe pause it before the point where Ricky Lake talks about how one of her people, they're glad that they went to the hospital. Maybe stop it before that point. I also have another video that I show my clients, Birth with Gloria LeMay. It's part of the package that I give to them, and we watch actual home births happening. And there's one with a mom who had a VBAC, and just showing the different environment and the different things that came up. One had a cord around the neck. It's not as big a deal as people say. The uterine rupture rate is actually really, really small. It gets inflated when VBAC tolerant care providers are talking about it, because the truth is, if they're VBAC tolerant, they will say things like, you have to have an epidural, and you have to come in as soon as you go into labor, and you have to have your baby by X number of weeks, and your baby has to be under X number of pounds. And like, they put all these restrictions. So it's like, oh, you can try a vaginal birth, and we're going to make it impossible for you to do that by putting all these restrictions on you. And that is not supporting the physiological birth process. So when you have that, and then on top of that, our culture is very much like, oh, VBAC, it's dangerous, the uterine rupture rate, because again, the VBAC tolerant care providers are talking about the uterine rupture rate, and they're saying, oh, it's so dangerous, but they're not talking about the risks of a repeat C-section. They're not talking about the relative risk of having a repeat C-section with an attempted VBAC under their care plan, as opposed to if you were to have a physiological birth. And they're not talking about how a lot of the uterine ruptures that happen is because Pitocin and Cytotec and all of these other drugs that are meant for induction and augmentation of labor is getting introduced into that. So again, if you want to know more about the uterine rupture rates and how the actual numbers stack up, you can go to vbacfacts.com and you can look that stuff up very easily. But the thing I tell my clients is that, well, okay, so you are going to wait, you're going to labor at home as long as possible. And they're like, yes. And it's like, and you're pretty much, your plan is to go in pushing. And they're like, yes. So then I'm like, okay, so, and if you gave birth in your car, what would that be like? And they're like, oh, I'd be totally fine with that, because then I avoided the hospital altogether. And I'm like, okay, So your plan is to either birth in your car or be birthing in the lobby of the hospital. And they're like, yes. And I'm like, okay, so at this point, you're telling me that you wouldn't even have like a care provider assessing you. Like you don't really feel like you need any assessments or anything like that. Your goal is to basically go in and just push a baby out. It's like, yes. I'm like, okay, so what if you just stay home and have them come to you if you feel you need them? And then that kind of shifts things. Now, there's some cases where you have, like you happen to be too far away from a hospital. Like this is another thing I see. And if you're willing to travel that many hours or whatever to get to a hospital and labor as long as possible, then there are other ways around that. What about checking into an Airbnb? My friend Jenny is actually working on this right now of seeing how we can create birth houses or birth rental spaces that would be like an Airbnb style idea. So then you don't have to worry about insurance or anything because it's basically your home. It's a home birth in a different home. Or there's hotels. You could go to a hotel and just birth in the hotel. Ironically, it's Christmas time or the holidays, and you could joke about how there's no room at the inn. Okay, well then you just go ahead and birth your baby in the car, set up your car real nice. Go to a friend's house, go to family members. I have one friend who said that she would probably want to be in a bigger area with a better hospital. And her plan was that if she got pregnant again, she was going to be staying with her family who is local in town, and they would put her up so that she could labor as long as possible, possibly have a home birth. And if at any point she felt that she needed to transfer, she'd be close enough to a hospital that it would be nice and seamless. So there are many different options that you can do, even if you happen to live further away from a hospital. Do not let the arbitrary restrictions keep you from having the kind of birth that you really want to have. You are in charge. And if at any point, if you're even just planning a home birth and then things kind of deviate and you're like, you know, I'm 43 weeks now. I kind of would like to be done being pregnant. And at this point, I feel comfortable to induce. Well, then again, you have that option because you can always change your mind. And if you ever have any questions or if you're feeling a lot of pressure and you just need somebody to help you get some clarity on the situation and just give you a little pick-me-up, you can message me anytime. You can send me an email at carly@empoweringmomsbirth.ca as well. And I will get back to you because one of the things that's my absolute passion is helping you get the birth that you really want to have and avoiding that fear. So when other people are putting fear on you and it's starting to put doubts in your head, my job has always been, when I'm talking with my clients, to get them back to what they want. So I'm like, okay, let's discuss this fear. Let's work through it. Okay, what part is coming up for you and what's somebody else trying to put their fears on you? And what do we know? And here you go. Now you're lifted back up. Now you're free to say no to what you don't want or ask for what you do want. And it's just, I've helped moms avoid so many inductions this way, just by doing a quick message with them. So that's always available to you. You can send me a message on Instagram, you can send me a message on Facebook, and you can email me. I also have a natural birth guide, and I've been getting a lot of feedback from a lot of the people who've already downloaded this guide, and they say, you know, like some of this stuff is just absolutely amazing, and I didn't know it. And I send great tips as well. All right, I will see you next week. I love you. I appreciate you. Bye.